everyone, this is Mrs. Carr, and I'm making a lesson recording on lesson 2.04 Revolution. So let's start with the lesson introduction. And we see the following. Once the colonists had declared independence, there was no turning back, but they certainly faced a daunting task. Their army was an inexperienced ragtag band of volunteer soldiers. Their only form of central government was the newly formed Continental Congress, which had very little authority. How could the American patriots expect to overcome the most powerful military force in the world? And let's go to the next page. And it talks about our goals for the lesson. Identify major events, leaders, and foreign assistance during the American Revolution. Identify major arguments for and against independence and the groups who supported each side. Summarize the advantages and disadvantages of each side at the beginning of the Revolutionary War. Recognize the contributions of foreign nations and individuals to the Revolution. And identify major events and leaders of the American Revolution. Don't forget to go to lesson resources up here and get your reading guide and lesson answer key for the lesson as well. And then it also has those items there for you. And then continuing on, daily checklist. What are we going to do today? We're going to read pages 144 through 160, complete the reading guide, complete the Tracking the Revolution activity online, and complete the 2.04 checkpoint at the end. So we should probably go to the lesson reading right now, page 144. And you see that's just the beginning of the chapter where it's the timeline and the picture there. So let's start here, the American Revolution. In New York City, when a crowd heard the Declaration of Independence read aloud, they responded by marching to nearby Bowling Green, where they toppled the statue of King George III astride his horse. One newspaper reported that with delight that the king lay prostrate on the dirt, the just desert of an ungrateful tyrant, and went on to add that the lead wherewith this monument was made is to be run into bullets. In the summer of 1776, images of King George were falling in cities and towns from Maine to Georgia. Men and women yanked the king's coat of arms from shops and tavern doorways. His effigy was burned in town and city squares. Virginia lawmakers decreed that ministers should no longer pray for the king and the royal family, but instead for the state's leaders. Across the Atlantic, King George and most of his ministers anticipated a speedy and decisive end to the rebellion. Surely these ragtag revolutionaries from 13 disparate colonies could never unify to challenge the most powerful army and navy in the world. Over the next 7 years, however, American forces battled from the backwoods of Maine to the island of Manhattan to the coast of Georgia. By the end, 13 former colonies had become, as the Declaration of Independence proclaimed them, the United States of America. For the first time in modern history, colonies had successfully risen up against the overwhelming might of the mother country and won independence. How did this come to pass? For and against independence. When the Declaration of Independence was read throughout the colonies, not all Americans responded with enthusiasm. As many as 20% of all white American colonists remained loyal to the British Crown. At least 80,000 of these loyalists, also called Tories, moved to England or Canada rather than stay in the independent United States. Many Quakers who were pacifists remained neutral in the conflict. And let's look at the definition over here of pacifist. They are someone who refuses to take up arms because they oppose violence for moral or religious reasons. Many other men and women simply want to be left to deal with their daily lives, growing crops and raising families. The prospect of a war with the mother country was daunting. And in many ways, the American Revolution was a civil war, a conflict between groups within one country. The conflict divided families. William Franklin, a former colonial governor of New Jersey, remained steadfastly loyal to Britain, while his father, Benjamin Franklin, emerged as a leading voice for independence. To exploit these divisions, the British sought to win over two groups that stood to gain little from independence: African slaves and Native Americans. As early as November 1775, Virginia's royal governor, Lord Dunmore, extended an offer of freedom to all indentured servants or slaves willing to bear arms for the British. Hundreds of slaves accepted Lord Dunmore's offer. Many Native Americans also sided with the British. After all, the British had tried to prevent the colonists from moving into Indian lands in the West. Despite these divisions, the cause of independence gained widespread support. Over the 10 years leading up to July 1776, hundreds of thousands of Americans had boycotted British goods because they believed that the king and Parliament were trampling on their rights. Many agree with Thomas Paine's argument in Common Sense that the only way to preserve American rights was to break away from Britain. On the western frontier, many men and women resented British rules that prevented them from settling new territory. Even those Americans who were at first undecided about independence began to turn against the British when they saw red-coated soldiers trampling the countryside and plundering American farms for food. Britain's advantages and disadvantages. Oh, first of all, let's look at the inset here. African Americans choose sides. In New England, scores of free blacks enlisted in state militias and fought alongside their white countrymen as patriots. In the South, however, most blacks were enslaved. When the British offered freedom to those slaves in exchange for military service, thousands of African Americans fled to British lines, choosing freedom under a king over slavery in a new republic. Others chose to stay where they were rather than to leave their loved ones behind. The decisions were never easy. Some 5,000 blacks are known to have fought on the American side during the war. About 20,000 left with the British for Canada or the Caribbean at war's end. But records are scant and the fate of tens of thousands of black Americans of the Revolutionary era remains unknown. Okay, now we'll read Britain's advantages and disadvantages. This is pretty important to note as we talk about the advantages and disadvantages of Great Britain and the colonies. You should probably pay particular attention to this section. In military strength and experience, the Redcoats had practically all the advantages. The Patriots' hastily organized Continental Army seemed to stand little chance against the British Army, the strongest military force in the world at the time. In the 1750s and 1760s, the British Army had fought and won battles around the globe, from Cuba to Senegal to India. By August 1776, nearly two-thirds of the British Army was in North America, supported by some 70 ships from the Royal Navy. English military leaders had decades of combat experience. General William Howe, commander of His Majesty's Army in the colonies, and Major General John Burgoyne, who commanded troops in Canada, had served in the 7 Years' War. Howe's brother, Admiral Lord Richard Howe, was an equally seasoned officer when he assumed command of the British Navy's operations in America. Many of the rank-and-file soldiers had 9 or 10 years of field experience. In addition, the British hired more than 30,000 experienced mercenaries from Hesse-Kassel and other German states. And it says mercenaries are soldiers hired by a foreign power to fight for pay. The British did face some significant disadvantages. They were less familiar with America's physical terrain than the Continentals, and their Hessian allies had little commitment to victory. They were soldiers for hire for whom American independence was but an abstract matter. The British and the Allies also had to ship basic supplies, food, munitions, and clothing, all the way from England. Often ships carrying these supplies never reached their destination in North America. Privateers, private vessels licensed by the Continental Congress, attacked British vessels on the Atlantic or stormed through the ships off course. Lacking supplies from the mother country, the British often took crops and livestock from the American farms, which turned local residents against them. The actions of some British soldiers and their allies worked to their own disadvantage. For example, in New Jersey, where in the late 1776 upward of 30,000 people had sworn allegiance to the British crown, the British turned loyalists to patriots when they plundered farms and households. One Hessian officer observed, "The English soldiers perpetuate daily the grossest highway robberies and even kill." An English officer, turning a critical eye on his German allies, noted that it is impossible to express the devastations which the Hessians have made upon the homes and county seats of some of the rebels. All their furniture, glasses, windows, and the very hangings of the rooms are demolished or defaced. Many New Jerseyans, angered by the destruction of their property, became fierce defenders of the patriot cause. America's military challenge. Although the British faced some real obstacles of victory, General Washington feared that the Americans would have a hard time winning independence. America had no real navy and until recently no organized army. Nor did American soldiers have much experience fighting wars. Even Washington, the commander-in-chief of the new Continental Army, had less battlefield experience than the typical British enlisted men. While the British Army enjoyed all the financial backing it needed, the new American government struggled to raise money to feed and clothe its troops. At first, most state regiments assumed, along with the Continental Congress, that their soldiers would outfit themselves. Historical records show that a private from Milford, Connecticut, who was a typical of many, was provisioned by his grandparents, who gave him his rifle, clothes, cake, cheese, and a Bible. Others were less fortunate. It was not uncommon for Continental troops to go for weeks and months without shoes, overcoats, or basic food supplies. Finally, Washington knew that American soldiers, whether drawn from town militias or recruited for the Continental Army itself, were not accustomed to military discipline and obeying commands. The same independent spirit that prompted Americans to break from Britain did not make for good military order. As Washington complained in September 1776, the militia showed an entire disregard of that order and subordination necessary to the well-being of the army. Washington considered the local militias unreliable as likely to go home and plant crops as they were to stay and fight. They negotiated rather than obeyed, made their own rules, designed their own uniforms, elected their own officers, and then tried to tell these officers what to do. Then there was a problem of forging a unified spirit among the rank and file troops. Turning the page. Most soldiers, if they had any experience at all, had served only in local militias. They were used to marching alongside their neighbors. But in the new Continental Army, regiments from various states often served side by side. Yankee mariners from Marblehead, Massachusetts found themselves thrown together with riflemen from the backwoods of Pennsylvania and Virginia, and sometimes they did not get along at all. For example, in Massachusetts in 1776, the men from Marblehead, sailors and fishermen in their fishermen's trousers, began to exchange insults with the ruffled and fringed Virginians. Some of the Marblehead men were Native Americans, black freedmen and former slaves, while some of the Virginia men were slave owners. Insults turned to blows, and within 5 minutes 1,000 American soldiers were on the verge of fighting against each other. Washington himself, along with his black servant, both on horseback, raced in to break up the fight. Clearly, if the Americans were to have any chance of winning this war, these quarrelsome strangers would have to find a way to become comrades. Even with the lack of unity, the Continental Army had one clear advantage. Its soldiers were deeply committed to the cause of independence. The British troops were fighting out of loyalty to the crown, while the Hessian mercenaries were fighting for money. The Continentals, however, were fighting for their homes and their families. The stakes were considerably greater for the Americans under George Washington's command. The times that try men's souls. When fighting at Lexington and Concord, British officials thought they could easily put down this local uprising among the Massachusetts rebels. But the British realized what they were facing when the Battle of Bunker Hill left more than 1,000 of their soldiers dead or wounded. Months later, British troops in Boston found themselves staring at the cannons that had been seized at Fort Ticonderoga by the men under Ethan Allen and Benedict Arnold. General William Howe, seeing that he was literally outgunned, ordered the British out of Boston, thus freeing the city from its long economic embargo and securing Washington's first major victory. The Redcoats kept a toehold in New England. Led by Sir Henry Clinton, the British won a victory at Newport, Rhode Island. They used Newport as a naval base until 1780. For the most part, however, the British gave up on New England and looked south. To end the rebellion quickly, George III sent a massive force of 32,000 troops across the Atlantic, while General Howe, fresh from his retreat from Boston, set his sight on New York. By winning New York, the British hoped to separate the rebellious New Englanders from the southern colonies and thus prevent any unified revolutionary effort. George Washington in command. We'll read this excerpt before we move on. In every respect, George Washington was suited for the role he assumed in the Revolutionary War. Tall and stately, he commanded the confidence and respect of those around him. He was a superb athlete and horseman. He radiated a sense of dignity and calm that steadied the nerve of his troops. He maintained full possession of himself, wrote a fellow officer, and was indefatigable night and day. Though he had once aspired to a commission in the British Army, he was quick to embrace the rebel cause. He understood that the war is a struggle against tyranny, as it refusal to let Britain take away rights and liberties, and thus reduce the Americans to a condition he saw as little better than slavery. Unhappy it is, he observed, that once the happy and peaceful plains of America are either to be drenched with blood or inhabited by slaves. Sad alternative, but can a virtuous man hesitate in his choice? Okay, I'm going to stop here for this one reading, and we'll pick up on the next recording with Defeat in New York.